You've got some serious choices on your hand today. The full-frame mirrorless market is, ironically, full now. Everyone has a version of their own mount, lenses, blah, 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 infinity. Well, today we've got two of the full-frame cameras that I frankly like quite a lot, and I don't think either gets enough coverage. How do you fix that? You make a whole bunch of videos about them and compare them against each other and see which one comes on top as the full-frame video powerhouse. The Nikon Z6 and the Canon EOS R. Let's smash them together, see what comes out on top. They're too expensive to smash together. What's up everyone, I'm the Everyday Dad, and if I can figure it out, you can figure it out. So look, you may or may not have noticed, but I really like cameras. It's just kind of a thing of mine. I mean, might be a mania? Today we've got the newer kids on the block, and as we've already compared both of these against the A7 III, it's time to compare them against each other. Because frankly, I like both of these more than I like the A7 III. Don't tell the internet. And we just happen to have both of these on our hands at the same time, which, I mean, I guess that's kind of convenient. Hooray. Before we get too far into the video, however, I do want to fully disclose that the Z6 is on loan to me from Nikon. So while this is my personal EOS R, I would like to say thanks to the folks over at Nikon for letting me borrow this camera for a couple of months, because I owned this before and I really liked it, and it's nice to get a chance to get some hands on with it again. Even before getting this loaner, I've made the claim, and I stick to this claim, that the Z6 is the best full-frame video camera on the market under $30,000, which with the release of the Kinfinity Mavo LF, I mean, it kind of brings it down to $12,000, but for $2,000, still pretty amazing to have the functionality that this guy has available to us. This video isn't gonna go very much in detail about either camera. If you'd like to see a more specific video, I will leave a link to both cameras' playlists in the description below. Longtime viewers know there are four main things I compare cameras against. And the first one of the bunch is video quality. The Nikon Z6 has a 24 megapixel full frame backside illuminated sensor. It can record in up to 4K 30 frames per second and can do that using the full width of the sensor. That's important here in just a second. If you saw Wednesday's video, you know why. It can do 1080p and up to 120 frames per second and has a 273-point phase detection autofocus system. The EOS R, on the other hand, has a 30 megapixel full frame CMOS sensor and can also record in up to 4K 30 frames per second. The main difference here is that because it has a it's got a bigger megapixel sensor, there is a pretty aggressive crop when recording in 4K, which adds a 1.7 times crop on top of your lenses. So this 35mm becomes like a 60mm. For slow motion, it can do 120 frames per second in 720p and has a 5,655 point dual pixel autofocus system. Something awesome that both cameras share is the ability to record up to 4K 10-bit 422 out to an external recorder, and the Canon has access to C-Log when recording internally. If you want to record log format on the Nikon, it does require that, you again record externally for that. That's kind of weird, and hopefully they'll be able to unlock that in a firmware update to just be able to record internally. But when it comes to the actual image quality, both are great. The biggest issue I have with the actual image quality is the default picture profile in the Nikon is just about the most contrasty thing I've ever seen. You absolutely have to go in and rework some of these settings to get a good image. I mean, it just crushes blacks, like in a terrible way, without any messing around default to the camera. So you do absolutely have to go in and rework some of these settings to get a good image. But when you do, it's really good. Now, my personal settings on the Z6 are the standard profile with contrast at -1 and sharpening at 0, and I really like how the image quality looks after that. The EOS R also needs a little bit of work to get a look that I'm really happy with, and my settings for this is fine detail +1 saturation. And you know what? Let's actually put both of these cameras back up to be the A and B camera, and we'll use these for the rest of the video. One second. Now, these changes take all of 5 seconds to do, so it's really a non-issue. I mean, I think both cameras look fantastic. Again, Nikon Z6 with an f4 lens, Canon EOS R with the 35mm macro lens. I will give the edge here to the Nikon because I much prefer having access to uncropped 4K, so I don't have to look for crazy wide lenses to balance out that 1.7 times crop. And if I'm gonna spend this kind of money on a camera, I mean, sorry Canon, I'd prefer to record in 4K, but this camera's super far away. I mean, this 35mm lens is now over 60 because of the 4K crop. Image quality only tells you half the story because you have to actually listen to stories, so, audio tells you the rest of the story. That makes sense. I do prefer the internal recording inside of the Canon more than the Nikon when set to auto audio recording. However, I don't recommend actually having your camera set to auto audio recording. You should set the internal preamp as low as possible and let your microphone do all of the heavy lifting for the camera. I mean, in this case, both work perfectly fine despite what the internet says. I still think the edge goes to Canon a little bit, but I mean, neither of these is as good as a Sony or Panasonic camera. Like those have audio on lock. Video quality is very much subjective. There's no way to say that a camera is objectively better looking than another. Somebody will always have a different personal preference. And very much on that subject, one of the, if not the most important things for me and for other online content creators is ease of use. I mean, gotta be easy because ain't nobody got time to be messing with a camera. I mean, seriously, nobody has time to fiddle with gear if you are just a one-person wrecking crew. One wrecking crew. Arrgh. This is gonna sound like a broken record from earlier, but both cameras are actually pretty darn easy to use. I like that both have fully touch-enabled screens that make it very easy to scroll through the settings and change from the screen if you don't want to mess with physical buttons. Also, both cameras have a very easy and intuitively laid out UI, so if you've never used Nikon or if you've never used Canon, it's easy to get into the system. This is actually tougher than I thought it would be to call because these two cameras are physically my favorite on the market right now. Both are just very well thought out and placed. They've got great accessory ports. They both have mini HDMI, which is the larger, which is awesome and way better than Sony's micro HDMI port. Both have reasonable battery life, but the big difference and the one that could be the most striking to me, and this could be a purchasing decision, balance maker right here, the EOS R takes SD and the Z6 takes XQD. Now, I do agree that potentially it's better to have an XQD. However, the Z6 doesn't really take advantage of that writing speed. The EOS R is the one that has the higher bitrate all-eye codec internally, where the Z6 doesn't. I mean, having an XQD, you would think this would be perfect to have a large, beefy codec built into it, or something like internal RAW. Maybe, hopefully, here's hoping. I do kind of wish they'd gone with a setup that the Panasonic did with the S1, where it has both an XQD and an SD. So cheap recording media, expensive recording media, they don't actually get used to its fullest potential. Now, these are two of my favorite feeling cameras currently on the market, and I will give the slight edge to the EOS R for tactile feel, but giving usability to the Z6 for having a joystick and not having a useless multifunction touch bar that I've literally never used. Canon, just get rid of it. But the real magic happens after you record in a little thing that I like to call fiddliness. And here we run into a roadblock on each. I look for three main things in fiddliness: autofocus, some kind of way to monitor, and stabilization. The EOS R hands down wins on autofocus, and having that flip out screen for monitoring, that's awesome. Plus, the eye autofocus in video and the fully articulating touchscreen combine to make this one of the easiest cameras ever made to use. It is a joy to make video with the EOS R. The Z6 does also have perfectly good autofocus, and it's actually got pretty good in-body image stabilization, but it has no way to monitor when it's recording. I mean, it's Canon that are unfortunately the only ones doling out this incredibly important feature. There is no other full-frame line on the market outside of Canon that has a flip-out screen. Even if you could just do like Fuji cameras and enable a tally light on the front so I could at least know it's recording, like right now, I don't even know if it's recording. I mean, it would be super useful to know that. I mean, that would be a very big step in the right direction. Whether or not this is a big deal to you generally comes down to where you spend your time, in front of or behind the camera. Honestly, when I'm behind the camera, I prefer the tilting screen. Like, I prefer this kind of tilting screen because it's just easier to get low shots with. I don't have to like pop it out and then flip it around. It's a lot easier. But I'd sacrifice that little bit of easy use to make being in front of the camera infinitely easier. It's just so much easier to have a way to monitor yourself built into the camera. So you've decided to buy into one of these systems. Which offers you the most when it comes to upgrading or building out your own lens selection, accessories, all of that stuff? What does the ecosystem look like? The EOS R and the Z6 are in the exact same spot. They're housing relatively new mounts, so the native lens selection is still being built out. The EOS R does have some crazy inventive glass, but that costs crazy inventive glass prices. The Z6 currently has a more standard lineup, including some awesome but pricey 1.8 primes with some of the smallest full-frame zoom lenses I've ever seen. We're currently in the 14 to 30 f4 lens, which is very small and awesome. But they also both have adapters allowing you to basically use their SLR glass like native if they have the required electronics. So honestly, this one is a wash. EF mount or Nikon F there's an insane amount of lenses for both. So it's choose the insane amount you want on each mount, right? So what, right? Which of these comes out on top if you are looking for a video camera? Now that, much like ease of use, it depends on where you shook out in that category, right? Do you spend your time behind the camera? Do you spend your time in front of the camera? If you want the flip out screen, then you have to go Canon. Nobody else is gonna give that to you in the mirrorless full frame marketplace. Nobody else. The Nikon just isn't gonna give you that level of functionality. But if you want the better video camera, and I actually prefer the Nikon color over the Canon color, then the Z6 absolutely wins. I love the image that the Z6 produces. I think the autofocus is great, and I like how small its full frame lenses are. The thing that I dislike most about full frame cameras is the size of full frame lenses, and the Z6 goes a long way toward making that smaller. Plus, you don't have to deal with any crops unless you want to, which makes buying wide angle lenses much easier. I can trust this 14 to 30, it doesn't turn into like a 28 to 50 on the EOS R. Thanks for watching.